Good afternoon. Welcome to our brown bag program today. We're very pleased to have Jeff Marshall speaking to us on investigating old houses. Jeff is well known to many of us in historic circles for his work on barns and also on dating old houses. And he's the author of numerous books. So it's a pleasure to have him here. Um, and after Jeff's presentation today, our Associate Director of Research, Dr. Meyer, who's in the back of the room, can answer any questions you might have about resources that we have here in our historical library if you're working on researching your old house. Today happens to be our last day of annual cleaning, so we just have our changing exhibits open, but not our historical library. So if you're interested in doing research, just come back during our normal hours. Our next brown bag program is February 12th.
After so that 40 years I was on staff at Heritage Conservancy and ended up as president for a while. All through that time, even before that, I've done this kind of work. So I love old buildings and I love trying to understand what they would get the sheets off of and what the food is about. So with that, here we go. That's it. So basically, a lot of people can start having a old house. They can. I know we can't do this in life, but so basically, if you have a building, it just stands there. It doesn't tell you anything about it. So you have to ask. You have to know what to ask or what to look for. This is what I would propose.
Excuse me, 1 minute, John.
Is that better? Oh, that's much better. All right. So basically, there's, I've built a technical grid, and how do you look at an old building? And as you see here, you got, both physical features and then historical research, and then each one of these has a little subset. And we're going to go through all of these today. So just want to let you know this is the process. The first thing, problems, so as I said, this is another way to look at the grid. You got to look at different things. You got to look at the building itself. You got to look at the courthouse, do research. You have to have a style guide to understand what the building looks like and where it fits in the history of architecture, and then go to a historical study, this one, to really build on that research. The first thing I look at is architectural building. Look at the building itself. And there is, unfortunately, no set rules to historic architecture. So there are styles, and people get style guides, and we talk about Georgian, Federal, Greek Revival styles. Problem is, there's no bright line between them. They are waves and they're overlapped. So you have buildings that have more than one architectural feature. So style gives you, as you see here, a one-shaped curve. Maybe 20 years where that style was common. Someone's the first to build it, it gets very common, and someone's to be the last to build it. So that's why it's a bell-shaped curve. And that's what this recognizes, that it's brand new, it's the first one in the area, to when it's the last one. So Georgia style, when you see here in Montgomery and Bucks County, big formal houses, usually a center hall, front and back hall. That's the Easter house. And this is a classic Georgian style. So we can get, again, our bell-shaped curve of one over time. Your next house one is an example of a building that's over in New Jersey, that's 1798, which is right between the Georgian and federal transition. So there's elements of both styles. That's that wave that we always do. So the federal style, for the most part, is like the Georgia style. It is not as bulky and big.
Can you click unmute?
Okay, hands off. Sorry. So the federal style is often also 5 bays wide, or with 2 windows each side, but it's generally not as big and as bulky and blocky as the as the Georgian style. And one of the hallmarks of the federal style is the introduction of the fanlight or half-round transom on top of the doors. That seems to be one of the quintessential aspects of the federal style. And this is an example of one, and it's always nice to have a building that has a date on it. So when you see the feature, you start to get some, context for it. Unfortunately, most stone houses in Montgomery or Bucks County have very little style. No offense to the house or the owners. They're basically a stone box, and any ornamentation is typically just around the front door where people can see it. So we call that vernacular or folk, when you don't really have a style. But we would think that this building is probably in the first quarter of the 19th century because it has that family. Then go on, and you have a number of houses, although these are very atypical in the rural parts of Bucks and Montgomery County, of a full Greek revival into an Italianate style. And the Greek revival, is often also a center hall house, 2 stories, or in this case, a 3rd story. And the 3rd story has the generally smaller 3rd floor windows called frieze, banned from the Greek entablature, or sometimes called eyebrow windows because they look like eyebrows. And then when you really want to get down to it, they're often called lie on your stomach windows, because the only way you can look out of them when you're in the attic is to lie on your stomach. But as compared to the federal fanlight that we saw in the, generation 4, Greek revival houses more typically have a rectangular transom that often extends beyond the door and goes over the side windows, which we call side lights. So that's a typical Greek revival feature. The other thing is, if you look carefully underneath the porch, you see that the framing around the door has these shoulders that come out, which are called crosets, which is a Greek revival feature. So you might have the same basic form, but have the difference in terms of the doorways and the window details. So that's something we look at. Again, you're just trying to get a ballpark date. And then the next ones we go into is in the mid-19th century, are Italianate and then into Second Empire. Italianate buildings often have a round arch as a highlight. Round arches just weren't used in the Greek revival. The Greeks didn't like round things for some reason in terms of their architecture, or at least Greek revival folks. And then the Second French Empire is the mansard roof. That's a typical building you see. And a mansard, this tower has a mansard roof. And those are typically 1860s and 1870s. Oh, I don't know why this is not going well here. All right. Again, so then one thing, styles can tell you an approximate time period, again, within 10, 20 or 30 years, perhaps. Here you see what's called a Gothic Revival house. And Gothic Revival is a house that has a cross gable, with a triangular little gable in the middle of the wall. And it often then would have a Gothic window, which is a pointed arch window. The Italian arch is rounded, Gothic arch window is pointed. Sometimes there's just no points to it. But that gives you a period of when this was most common. And I will tell you, having done this for 47 years, this was not common in 1702 when the tax collector for the English crown supposedly built this house. So that gives you that start. So now you look at your building. And then a couple things about looking at old buildings. There's a difference between dating it and sequencing it. Telling which section comes first is often easier than saying when was that section built. But it gives you a chance that if you date one, then you can know the other is either earlier or later. And the things we look for are the cornerstones called coins. Coins are on the outside corner of a building. So if you look at the picture above, the yellow lines are coins. If you look at the red line, the front of this house, which is now the front facing left, doesn't have coins. It is just a cold joint or just abutted against an existing structure. This tells someone who is looking at the building that the section to the right came first. That's the sequence. The other thing, there are a number of features which are diagnostic, which have very little documentation. In Bucks and Montgomery County, one of the things we see, and this is the Thompson Neely house up in Washington's Crossing. Anyone knows it and should go see it. There are interesting features to this which are then usable in other places. One is that houses in Bucks and Montgomery, Chester, seem to have segmental relieving arches above the window and door openings. Kind of these like eyebrows. And those are almost always before the Revolution. And I don't know why and when they changed. But that's just something you see when you see enough of them. The other thing is a formal house will have what's called a pronounced water table, that the basement level projects out a couple inches. That's so when the rainwater splashes off the house, it doesn't go down against the foundation. Having a pediment or a hood is almost always pre-revolutionary in our region. And lastly, for some reason, and no one has been able to tell me this, prior to the Revolution, doors were flush with the outside plane of the house rather than being recessed. Anyone who's got a stone house now, typically the wooden door is recessed on the inner wall as compared to on the outer wall. Having it on the outer wall requires you to have some sort of pediment or some sort of protection, otherwise it gets weather damaged. Again, there's nothing written about this in any of the literature as to why, but it's one of these, again, my bell-shaped curve. You almost always see these before the Revolution. This is the next part of the same building, and it has a 1788 date stone on it, so it's post-revolutionary. So we're going to look at a couple things here. We see that it has a recessed door. This is what I'm talking about. The door is set back. It doesn't have the keystone. I'm sorry, it doesn't have segmental arch. Often it would have either a stone lintel or if it does have voussoirs, they are in the form of a flat jack arch with a pronounced keystone. And we know this is addition because if you look above the word recess, you see the cornerstones facing the left side, that was an outside corner. So we know, and it should be, the 1757 section came before the 1788 section. And that's the kind of stuff we look at in terms of sequencing. So once you have one or two or three or 10 of these, you can look at them. And for example, 3 of these houses are dated, but the 4th one in the upper left-hand corner is not dated. So now we have a general idea of when this should have been built. And that's how using comparables work. So you try to find features which are diagnostic and you try to associate them with documented buildings, and then we use them to try to interpret when an existing building may be built. The other thing we do is we look at architecture and building style. I am actually, as a volunteer at the Bucks County Historic Society, going through Henry Mercer's book on dating old houses, his papers, and I'm going through and updating it and trying to modernize it. So look for a joint publication between Henry and I to come out in the future. So what Henry looked at are hardware and architectural details. Henry was an archaeologist, and he was very smart in understanding a building can't be built before the materials or the techniques or the styles or materials and techniques and elements were invented. So you can't build something like if you have a house today, or you go look at an old house and you see a Phillips screwdriver or a drywall screw, you know it's not 18th century. Well, maybe, but it's probably not. But that's the idea what Henry said. If you know the technology and it's used as an original part of the original fabric, then you can say with some idea of, again, a bell-shaped curve when the house was built. And he did 100 some odd buildings throughout Bucks, Montgomery, and other areas. And I'm going through that now. I'm going through trying to find them, see if they're still there, and looking at them. So what we do is we call explorative demolition. We take a peek and look at the elements that are least likely to be changed. This is another way to do it. I often refer to this as how not to be invited back for a second visit. What you see is lath. The lath holds plaster, and in the 18th century, lath was hand split, so it's very wavy. In the 19th century, it was cut on saws, so it's all very irregular. So by seeing the lath, you can determine if the house was built after the 1830s or so when circular sawn or sawn lath becomes available. So here's the difference. You see the one to the left, how irregular the pieces of wood are? And see the one to the right, they're all very irregular. And for those who don't know, the purpose of the lath is when you put the plaster on, it's supposed to ooze through the cracks and harden and forms what's called keys. So it's very important. And if you ever renovate an old house and rip all this stuff out, take pictures of it, save it. Don't just throw it away. But the building to the left would be most likely 18th century, and the building to the right, 19th century. So again, you try to find a feature. I've been trying to, without success, to figure out how long houses have bake ovens. We know generally stoves become very common in Pennsylvania Germans for heating and later for cooking. And there's no data, as to when that transition occurred. I would think it's somewhere in the 1850s or 30s, 1830s, 1850s, when people start phasing out bake ovens and putting, metal ovens in the house, but we don't know. The problem when you look at these comparables is, this is off the web because I was looking up beehive ovens, is the person said that this beehive oven comes from a house dated 1720. The question is, how do you know? What are your facts that say it's 1720? And so that's always something when you look at documents on old houses. Are they from credible sources, or are they somebody's best estimates? And we'll come back to that later. So you look at the building. So then you start the hard part, or the complicated part, which is doing deed research. So you spend your time going through all sorts of documents. And that is, forgive the pun, the foundation for telling the story of an old house. It is knowing deed research, who owned the property. And here's the bad news. Deeds are land records. They don't say anything about the building about 95% of the time. The presumption is you own the land, you own what's on it. Why waste time? You're paying the scribe by the word to put all that stuff in your deed. So that's the first bad news. The second bad news is every piece of land in Pennsylvania goes back to William Penn Grant. So when you read, particularly real estate ads that say part of a William Penn Grant, don't be overly impressed. I grew up in Levittown, and I traced my property back to a William Penn. And I do not think William Penn or any of his sons lived in my house in Red Rose Gate, but that's another story. So here's a reference. You find these great defined information about houses. You have to go to other sources, so like newspapers, and I'll come back to that. So you do deed research, and you do that at the courthouse. Most deeds recorded. Most deeds. Deeds do not have to be recorded. They were recorded if someone held a mortgage, because they certainly wanted that known, but you didn't have to record a deed. So there are many times you run into unrecorded deeds, and they are called indentures.
And if you notice the top of the two deeds to the lower right-hand side, they're scalloped. And the story goes, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, is that you would have two copies of the deeds, one for the buyer, one for the seller, and you would cut it on an irregular pattern so that two pieces could be fitted together and make sure you didn't make it up as you went along. I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing you do is you go to the courthouse, or both Bucks and Montgomery have remote access to the deeds office and to their property tax records. So you either go to physically to the courthouse, or you go to the county's GIS website, either Bucks or Montgomery, and you find it. And you find it on a tax map. Make sure you're on the right piece of land. One of the key things I've learned in doing research all these years, your results are much better if you end up researching the correct property. It's one of those little clues that I think is important. So you start with tax map, and they're not engineering maps. They are for tax records. So don't get worried about them. And for some reason, Montgomery County has them like on a skewed angle, like you're flying over to the tax map office. So instead of being perpendicular, and I never understood why, but that's how you do it. Then you go and you get a record, and this is what the tax records look like. And I have cleverly redacted the person's name, but it tells you the, the parcel number, the land use codes, all sorts of neat stuff. And somewhere down here, it has near the bottom, the deed booking page where that deed is recorded. That's important. Montgomery County is also very good, because if you go to that webpage, they also have in the drop-down file, and Bucks has a sketch, the building by its dimensions. But Montgomery County also has photographs of all the buildings. Much more progressive. So then you can go from this website to the Recorder of Deeds websites and start your search. Or you physically can go to Recorder of Deeds office in both counties. In Bucks County, they have a weird system where you pay 15 cents a minute and 10 cents for every document you look at. In Montgomery County, they charge you $25 and you have 24 hours to do whatever it is you want. Both have their advantages. You don't feel the pressure of having to, throw your pennies around. But that's how you do it. And you literally go to that deed, and at the bottom of the deed, it should say, being the same property that somebody sold to that person. And you literally go back and back and back and back. When it becomes difficult is as the property gets bigger, and we'll come back to this later, it includes more and more land and many other potentially old houses, which literally have the exact same history. It also gets problematic if you have, say, a 40-acre piece of land and the guy bought it in 4 separate pieces. You almost have to go back to the tax map, figure out, if you were to draw the properties out and come back to drawing them out, which of the 4 has the house, and make sure you, again, trace the right piece back. So, and some key words that we see is the grantee is the buyer, grantor is the seller. There's a word which I never knew how to say. I don't know if it's French, called messelage or messerage, which means dwelling house. And often if it has that, there was a house on the property. Not necessarily your house, but a house. And the other terms, they would say tract or lot of land. People get excited when they read that their property was part of a plantation. Plantation is an 18th century word for farm, so don't get too excited. And hereditary, that means that they didn't include what's on it. That means you get everything on the property. That's kind of a catch-all. If they didn't mention it at the beginning, it's now included. So then you go to a deed, and it says, beginning at a, somebody's property, often at a white oak tree, and it tells you to go north 46 degrees east and a distance. The distance used in old deeds is a perch, which is 16.5 feet. That's just one of those weird things. Okay, so then you get yourself a compass, and round compass is better, and you do what it says to do. Go north, draw the north, swing it over 30 degrees, make a mark, measure out whatever distance you have, and you just keep going around the clock until you end up with a shape that theoretically closes. Otherwise, you go to some free website called Meets and Bounds or something similar, and you download a free app that does it for you. And there's half dozen of them. And I just use this one because I'm just too lazy to change. It's not the best I've ever used, but it's one I can always find. And you literally just type in north 26 degrees east and then boom, 20 feet or whatever. You might have to translate feet to perches because this one doesn't do that, but it's easy to do. And so you get the shape of the property. So a couple of things when you do deeds, it's not just the buyer and seller. There are clues that you look for. One is that, for example, you see someone buys a 50-acre property in a certain year in 1850 for $300, and he sells it 5 years later for $2,400. One can infer he's either a con man or perhaps a house or barn or was built on the property where the property was dramatically improved. If that is corroborated by the first deed saying a lot for 500 acres and the second deed saying a messuage and lot for 2,400, then you have a better likelihood that it is in fact directly related. The other fun part about deeds, old deeds, because people don't have like good addresses like we have today, to identify it's the right person. The deed will almost always say the person who's selling, the person's spouse, the municipality the person lives in, and the person's occupation. So all of a sudden you start finding really more about the people. And when it comes down to it, people are really more fun than buildings. And often they'll say, they give to their son, right, for $1. Why is it sold for $1? For love and affection. A lot of deeds say for love and affection. So these things, as you do this kind of stuff, you try to take note of. And I always tell people who do this themselves, make copies. It's easier to come back and look at it later once you have a better understanding of what came earlier or came later than it is to go back to the website and either download it again or look at it again. So invest the money. If you go to the courthouse, bring a bunch of quarters or whatever they take and make copies of things. And then if you find someone who can help you, or you can come to like the library here with your material, it's a lot easier for people to help you. Oh, make copies. So one of the good things about doing this is there are some helpful hints along the way. One are old maps. The oldest map for Montgomery County is 1849, and it shows a dot, which is representative of a farm, house, barn, and whole thing. It's not a cadastral map that has to really bite the details, but it's good to have. And here's an example of property I did research on, and it'll tell you who owned the properties. And if there's a dot there, there's indication there was probably a house there. It also lets you see if it's a big piece of land, where other houses owned by the same person might be. So here's an example of the 1871 map. There's a wonderful website called Historic Mapworks that has most of these maps online. And for the 1871 or 1874, one of the maps in Montgomery and the 1876 in Bucks, there's actually a button underneath the maps that lets you superimpose that map on a current road map. It is the coolest thing. So here you see on the right is the names that are shaded are from the 1876 map, or sorry, 1871 map. And you can see the name H. Walter, which is circled on the left-hand side. You can see it on the right-hand side of there. So now you have the modern road names. It's a relatively new tool. So when in doubt, and you've got your research back to 1870s in Bucks or Montgomery, stop for a second, go to Historic Mapworks, make sure that name is the name that is in your deed research. Because I would go out on a big limb here and say, if the name you have doesn't match the map, you're wrong, not the map. No disrespect. And occasionally there are errors. There occasionally when you're doing these maps comprehensively, some buildings get missed. I've seen buildings that I know are older than that just for some reason don't show up on these maps. But this is, to me, is like the greatest tool as a checkpoint halfway through or through your research. There are also maps from the 1850s, 60s, on that don't necessarily have the detail and aren't transferable. But again, if you do your deed research and you see a dot with your name on it, again, you have a stronger likelihood that there was a house there at the time. In Montgomery County, there's also a great website put out Actually, it's mapping West Philadelphia, but for some reason it includes all the way into Montgomery County, where somebody did research and did a connected drawing of all the county by its 1777 owners. So if you have an 18th century house, it is really nice to, have this as a fallback. Make sure you're on the right piece of land. Won't tell you anything about the buildings. It just helps reassure you're on the right piece of land. All right. I've made every mistake you can make researching an old house over my years. So I'd like to share some of them. One is you can't assume that the building that was there in any year, 1710, 1810, 1910, is the building that's there today. That's why we go back to always looking at the structure itself. Okay, because, houses were replaced on a strong, very fairly regular basis. In 1798, there are taxes in all of Upper Bucks that tell us what every building was made of. In Montgomery County, it's more spotty, but in Bucks County, 80% of the houses more in 1798 from Doylestown through Durham were log. So if you have a stone house, statistically, it's not from the 18th century. The other point is when you take an old map, and I just went to this house a few weeks ago for the property owner, and you draw the properties out using its deed in 1767, and you superimpose it on the map, you see here that there are 3 old houses on that today. Each one of those go back to the same 1767 deed. And the guy was all excited because he thought he had the house built by selling with this guy's name, and I forget the name, William Williams, clever name. And it turns out it isn't his house. His house is the one in the pink, and the real old house is the one in the yellow. So his house is not the house that he wanted it to be. And he promptly said he didn't want me to do the research anymore. So short of telling somebody they've got ugly children, the best way not to be invited back is to tell somebody who bought a house with a lot of money, thinking it was from the 1760s, it's from like 1820 or 1830. People don't like that. Now, here's an example to the nth degree. This is an 1891 map in Upper Makefield, right outside Washington's Crossing. And I researched this back to a grant to a man named Francis Richardson, who was a Philadelphia silversmith. So I know he didn't live there. It was a real estate thing. So he sold it to a guy named Tomlinson, more than you need to care about. Okay. When you look at the 1891 map, I can't count that high. Each one of those houses has the exact same history. Each one of those houses may have been the house that is owned by William Tomlinson. So again, take it with a grain of salt, but it's certainly better than not having anything at all. All right, so that gives you the first step, is who owned it. The other things we want to look at are wills, orphans court, and road petitions. And I am more familiar with road petitions in Bucks than I am in Montgomery, so I apologize for that. But wills and orphans court are in both counties, and there are a wealth of information. And here's some other stuff that you can look at throughout the whole process. And I'll give you a second just to take a quick look. This is when, and by the way, I didn't give my thinly veiled commercial. Since I've retired, I do this for folks for a fee. People say, how much? And I say, as much as I can. So I look at your house and I see what kind of silver you have. And then I determine how difficult the research will be based on your personal property. But basically, we'll come to that. That's another story. All right, next. So then there are public sales. Public sales are often advertised in newspapers. There are also a number of wall maps, particularly in Bucks and New Jersey, not so much in Montgomery, that have lithographs, and you can actually see the buildings as they look in a period of time. So this is one that is in the village of Buckingham. And you can see that we know the date. There's a sale in 1857. The picture at the upper left is from the 1859 Atlas, and the picture on the right is a couple of years ago. So I feel very confident that this house is before 1857. Now, this would be tough to read. These are wills, and a lot of times they have a lot of stuff. And I deal mostly with men wills rather than women's wills. So I'm going to try to turn my back and talk at the same time. So this one, if you see it, where it's underlined in red, he gives his widow the use of the frame kitchen on his house. Okay, so now we think he's got a stone or log house with a frame kitchen. So now we're learning more about the house. All right, and then you get the room upstairs and the kitchen below stairs. So now it's a two-story house. Lodging room below stairs. So he lived on the first floor. People don't realize that a lot of the older generation owned properties, they lived in what we call the parlor, the living room, and let the kids sleep upstairs. They lived in the best room. So we learn all that. Now, one of the things that most will say is that husbands are often very generous to their wives. When you see that circled in orange, as long as she remains my widow. If you marry some young dude, you lose everything. So that is in, I'd say about 90% of all the wills I read, as long as she remains my widow. You know, and then there's some other things to talk about things. And then up here, whoop, back my elbow. Let me go back for a second. So, and then up there, he gives his wife the use of the 10-plate stove. So now we're really starting to, I am drawing out the house in my mind. And this is what this stuff does. This is the will itself. When wills were filed, they also filed an inventory. Somebody went through and appraised all your goods so that you could pay your inheritance tax, and so you could make a distribution amongst your heirs. So here's the one here. So this one, you can see it's the same property. The first one is in the new room, I'm sorry, in the new house below stairs. So we had a house either adjoining the old house or he built it now. So now we have two houses on the property. I'm not sure if they're adjoining or separate, but there's two houses. And it's a 2-room deep house because there's a front room upstairs and a back room upstairs. There's the garret, which is the attic, and there's stuff in the old house chamber. So the fact that it's all part of one inventory makes me think it's a house that's built together, built in multi-sections. And they get something else in the old house, and then something in the new cellar and the new kitchen. So you can now put, and this is 1770. So you can start to put together a picture of what this guy's house looked like. And this is, you know, all this other neat stuff. And if you're into barns, which I am, you can see what was in the barn. You know, there's a threshing floor, there's a hay, there's more hay, you know, in the barracks, which are buildings that are built outside of a barn. Straw, rye, and most of the, you know, here in Montgomery, rye is the biggest crop. So looking at the inventories is very important, and they're generally at the courthouses. The other thing are orphans court drafts. If you die with a bunch of kids and you have a certain amount of land, you can't equally divide it between them. If you die without a will and you have heirs, you know, the heirs petition the court to make a partition, make it first and appraise it, and then make a partition. So basically, someone will go out and survey the property. And sometimes you get these great things like the one up here. You know, there's a barn and a mansion. You can see they're labeled. The one here's got a great looking little house and a big, big house. The one over there has a house. So, and the one in the upper left, you see there's actually a graveyard shown on the property. So orphans courts are great. Nothing like people fighting over money for details. What happened is you go out, and I'll go to the guy on the right because that's right near my house. And son Enos Merrick got the piece in the middle with the house. Because I went through it, and it gives you the distribution, who gets what piece. And then you pay your heirs the relatively amount what they owe, you know, because they didn't get the piece. But it now tells us that there were no houses on anything but that piece. So each of the other sons get their property in 1820, I think that is. Their houses aren't going to be before 1820. The only house on that 189 acres was that one. And the same thing with these others. The only houses on the property are the ones that are shown. Tells you that if your house is over here, it's not that old. And it's, again, that's what I call negative evidence. In this is a house I researched that it's marked in red. It wasn't there when this orphans court was done in 1835. The old house is over there in green. So the house I'm researching wasn't as old as the guy wanted it to be. There's something about people who want to live in an 18th century house. So, but this is again how one really starts taking the deed research, which is just they said the foundation, and really building on the story. Again, more familiar in Bucks County than Montgomery County, but old newspapers are on file at the Bucks County Historical Society. And I can't tell you much about Montgomery, I apologize, but they will give you often a very good description of what is on the property. And then this is the case of the house I'm researching, and I found the newspaper advertisement, the locations, a large stone house built in the modern style with a two-story kitchen and dining. So you can see the main house, and in the back is the two-story kitchen. So it was all there by the year of this orphans court, and I mean the advertisement, and it was considered relative in 1857. So this three-story Greek revival with the lie in your stomach windows is a new style in the 1850s. Again, grain of salt, 5, 10, 15 years. All the stuff makes sense. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, it tells you what wasn't there or what was there. For example, this one was built the last season. So we know to the year when the house was built. This happens 1 out of 100 times. So don't get excited. It's going to happen in most cases. And again, here's another example of one that someone has a beautiful two-story stone house, which they thought was 18th century. But in 1824, the house there was part stone and part log, only 1.5 story tall, which is fine, you know, as a historian. So either the house was raised, and many houses were, you added a second layer, or the house that the person who asked me to do the research is not this house. And there's also a log barn on the property. And this is in Montgomery County. And a lot of people don't believe there were a lot of log houses in Montgomery County. And there were. Log barns too. There's a misconception that, you know, there weren't, but there certainly weren't. Even Upper Providence, which is not an overly Germanic area, there was a log house, although I think Mr. Aschenfelder rather was German. There are tax records. Tax records are one of those tantalizing things because they're available, but they rarely tell you anything. They could tell you how much your property was valued, but with one exception, which I'll come back to, they don't say anything about the buildings. In Bucks County, there's a 1780 tax list that will mention buildings. But for the most part, they just tax you on your acreage and a per acre price. And what happens is the prices fluctuate because there's township-wide reassessments. And very rarely do tax records tell you what you want to know, which is, you would think that if you have a house on 50 acres, a little log house, and you replace it with a stone house, your taxes go up. But it didn't, because the tax is really based on the farmland, not the buildings. If you have a 1 acre lot in a village and your taxes go from, you know, $500 to $3,000, that makes more sense. But in a rural setting, that they're not very helpful, and I always end up going through them and always end up telling myself, why am I wasting my time? Because I know one of these days, if I don't, it'll be there. The exception is the 1798 federal direct tax called the window pane tax. And in this thing, you see the middle 3 columns, they actually went through and they counted the window panes because they were a luxury item. But more importantly, they tell you what the buildings are made of and their dimensions. And this is a great one. This is Horsham Township. Other ones are not as detailed. Abington on the top is more detailed. The one in Marlborough on the bottom just says the value of the buildings. It doesn't say anything about their dimensions, their size. I don't know why. Don't know if they were lost, lazy or tax collector or whatever. But if you're in one of the municipalities, in Bucks County, it's all the upper Bucks County counties. In Montgomery County, it's maybe 4 or 5. It's wonderful because it'll tell you for sure if the building was there. The other ones in most of Montgomery County, you almost have to do an assessment in the sense of, if you know, for example, in Marlborough, the Andreas Reed house is one of the beautiful old stone houses. If you know that that house was valued at, say, $800, and the house you're researching is valued at $350, your house isn't as nice as it is. And what I've done because I don't sleep at night and I have no life, is I've gone through these tax lists and sorted them by value. so that if I do know of a specific house, I can tell you, relatively speaking, your house is worth $350, and it's in the bottom 10% or upper 5%. So again, you start to get a feel for the house. Again, not exact, but it's better than nothing. All right. One of the things is you go, you look at the house, and one of the things I love are date stones. I am in one of the few businesses where carved in stone doesn't mean what it does in other people's businesses. So here's some hard-earned lessons. And there's nothing worse than telling a person who has got a date stone in their house, that ain't your house. That's wrong. Okay, first one rule of thumb. They were never put in upside down. Okay? That's rule one. Number two, they never used the word circa. They knew exactly what year it was. Okay? They are not hidden in the inside wall of a fireplace. Okay? They are not hidden on the back wall right on the ground. What happened is these date stones were reused. A lot of times, and in this case, I researched it and I knew the initials. The initials were for adjoining property owner. So basically what happened, there was a pile of rubble and this guy either bought or stole the stone and built his new house with it. A lot of times if it's in your family, you don't want to just, get rid of all trace of granddad or great granddad. So you reuse it and you put it in a place where no one with any common sense would believe it dates to the current house, unless of course you're just buying it in 2023 and then you believe anything. So date stones are important, but they are not, again, something you can always use. And here's one that's completely hidden in the basement. Now, a friend of mine just posted on the Bucks County History Group, 1787. Here's my barn date stone. It was in the inside wall of the back of the, it was no more than how that barn than 1492 would have been if it said that. Again, people didn't want to just, you don't want to just turn it around and just hide it forever, but you don't want to put it where people think it. So that's, my bad news, folks. Okay, so I've taken a lot of time here. I want to leave time for questions. I went a little long. So if you do need help, you can call me or email me, and you can either send me photos or ask me to come out and take a walk through. And I'd be happy to try to talk you through the process of what to do next if you run into a problem. And as I said, if you take copies of the deeds and you can scan them and send them, I'd be happy to try to, help you get over that hurdle to get to the next step and, spend more time telling you other sources that might be available on a case-by-case basis. It is hard to do, how you just do all this stuff in less than an hour, and I went a little longer than I wanted to, but it is a combination of art and science. The science is getting it right. The art is understanding what the facts you found mean and putting them in context. And that, when most people who research old houses, it's the only one they'll ever research, so they don't have that broader context or understanding of architecture, of what style it is and when that style is most prevalent. So with that, I am done the formal presentation, and I guess we will take questions. Are there any questions? Sorry, I so confuse you as to make you numb. Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. In reading old newspapers, I have not seen, there's also insurance records around and mechanics liens around. I have not seen a log barn and a log house described as, quote, new after about 1830 or 1840.
Hey, Jeff, could you please repeat the questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, when were log houses stopped being built? And the answer is probably well into the first quarter of the 19th century.
Have a lot of holes exposed on the inside of the house. So you can see, guessing just sun logs. So I guess they built this house, modernized house around this Old.
Most log houses were covered to protect not just the logs, but the chinking between the logs. So when they could, they would cover them in something, weatherboard or something else. But most of Berks County has 1798 federal direct taxes as well. And some of the federal direct taxes, depending on the sharpness of the assessor, will say something like old, new, sometimes if you're really lucky, unfinished. So again, that's the best source for determining whether something's 18th or 19th century. And again, but log houses didn't stop being built in the 18th century. Anybody? Way in the back. The question, and I think it was, what does that mean? That there's some vertical logs in an old house. Vertical logs, if they're slabs, are often partitions instead of before they had lath. If it's of some depth, most log houses were horizontal with interlocking corners. The other style of log house, which is less frequent but more frequent than vertical log, is having horizontal logs and the vertical corner posts, which have notches in them, and you slide the things down like a Lincoln, I don't know, whatever that game is the kids play. So those are the most common types of log houses. And the second one are often plank houses, and they're not big round logs, but just meaty chunks of wood. Vertical log buildings are extremely rare, and so I can't tell you what that might mean. Okay. Right. Yeah, and vertical, it could have been a partition that might have been an interior wall once, or a lot of houses, a number of houses were log houses, except the wall with the fireplace was stone. You don't want your log house to burn down. So a lot of times you have a stone end, I call stone end log house, and and the stone end is there, and the log end, either gets replaced or in your case doesn't get replaced. But that's the other unique permutation. Yes, ma'am.
Being total. Like his wife. Big barn, there's a lot of additions. Sure. What is the best starting? Take a picture of the house and look at it.
The question is that she's a house that's reputed to be 1790s. What's the best starting point for researching it? The best way to make sure you are accurate is to start with the present day, go all the way back. And again, depending on where it is, if it's in an area that has the 1798 federal direct tax, you can tell if it was there then. And as I said earlier, a lot of the tax records will say the house is new or old or won't say anything. So that's the best way to do it. You can cheat and start with, like, say, what county is it in? I'm sorry, I didn't ask. Montgomery. So you go to the 1849 Montgomery County map. You find it on the map, you find that name, and you do what's called a grantee index search. You look in the deed indexes for that name and hope he didn't own 7 or 8 properties. And then you start from there and go back to there. So you go back to 1798, you take that break, you find the tax list, and then you know if it's there or it's not. And I can tell you from experience, a house from 1810 looks a heck of a lot like a house from 1790. And as I said, for at least in Bucks County, statistically, if it's a nice little stone house, it's probably from 1810-ish than 1790-ish. But it may very well be, and it may be older, but that's how you do it. I often will let people ask me, just take the shortcut, just get back there as fast, and then figure out, was it there in 1798? Yes, sir.
Does it bring a walk-in fireplace in the basement of a bank house do anything for dating?
Question was, does a basement fireplace in a bank house do anything for dating? They are extremely rare. So I would suggest it is probably 18th century if it has that feature. That was very uncommon. When you own 100 acres, you don't really have to be conservative in your building in terms of your square footage of your house. So there's no reason to put your fireplace in the basement. unless it's very early and is a bank house. And it's a bank house because you didn't want to spend the time to build a full house. You want to get out of the elements. And so you were built into a bank. And again, with no facts, that to me is more of a 18th century feature than a 19th century. It is what we call a starter house, a settler's cabin. And most of the time, people didn't want to have to go in their basement to cook. So they, yeah. And in fact, the other point is the bigger the fireplace, the older the house. Think of it conceptually that they're really big walk-in fireplace 18th century. And by say 1860, they didn't use them at all. So they're progressively getting smaller as technology improves. And you have Count Rumford come along and be your brain and design the shapes of fireplaces for the draft and stuff. So again, the rule of thumb is the bigger the fireplace, the older the house.
Jeff, we have a question online. Were log houses considered less desirable than other types of construction?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Were log houses considered less desirable than other types of construction?
Log houses were considered less desirable by snobby English settlers. German settlers did not feel any problem with a log house. And when they got more money, they built a bigger log house. There are some accounts in Bucks County in the 17th century of how wretchedly cold and inefficient frame houses were. So a log house is A, much more energy efficient, and B, a heck of a lot easier and faster to build than a frame house, and certainly easier to build than a stone house, which takes years of amassing field stone. So again, as a rule of thumb, be prejudiced. English had a tendency, when they could, to replace log buildings with stone buildings. And to them, it was less nice to live in a log house. And often people would hide the fact they had log houses with siding, which is not just for that feeling of inaccuracy, but also is a vapor barrier, keeps them warmer. Do you have another question back here?
Do radius window jams?
Oh, that's a great question. The question is, does radius window jams mean anything? And by a radius window jam, I am thinking you mean that instead of having a wood frame, you have a quarter turn plastered reveal on the sides of the windows. Now, in the 18th century, people would often just have plaster and just a little gentle curve where you touch the inside wall. It seems to me, and having done this research, that buildings between 1830 and 1870 have that full, robust quarter turn, which was a design element. It might be a Greek Revival design element, or at least it's during the Greek Revival period. And I've done a study of a number of them where I have them dated, and they almost always fall between 1830. The latest one is the Wrightstown Pence Park Schoolhouse in 1870. Great question. I'm going to the back first. Yes, stone houses, where the stone is actually rounded, and I could, anyone would stay, I could show you on my computer some pictures of them. I don't know how to do it here, but I could do that. 1830, 1870 is when they're dated, that's when I've seen them. Not just where they're just slightly done, but when there's a full, robust quarter turn. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
One thing people might be interested in is using dendrochronology.
Yes.
As data house. I had a dendrochronologist come in and take 2 houses on my property to the exact year by a fascinating test. And there was some gentlemen from Columbia University and Columbia and Arizona, 2 main places in America where dendrochronology database. But it's amazing to watch somebody come in and bore some holes in your beams and actually go back up to the date your the tree rings.
Yeah, the comment was dendrochronology becoming used as a way to date wooden structures. There's actually a man who lives in Haycock, Bucks County, who does dendrochronology as well. And he uses the Oxford Laboratory in England and sends his samples out. But I researched his old house and got his warrant back to 1760. He did dendro and found the building with the trees were felled in 1740s. So yes, sometimes it can be very good. It depends on the nature of the sample and whether there's wane and all the stuff on the tree. But that is, again, going back to my point earlier about context. You got to make sure this data sample they're using is accurate. So if they say this has a ring pattern the same as the 1720 Joe Blow house. If Joe Blow's house wasn't really 1720, it throws it off. But when it works, it works. Right. Yep. Again.
It was done.
Yep.
I asked them, they said because the wood is wet, and if you let it sit around, it starts working and checking and bending, and so. Let it during the winter, build in the spring, where you lose your usefulness.
Again, that's very recent technology, but it is up and coming. You know, it's again, until somebody refutes the comparable, it's the best thing we have. It's expensive still. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Anybody else have any questions?
Jeff, we have some more online questions.
Okay, I'm ready.
How do you date an old carriage barn? The original house on the property has been torn down.
I think flowers and candy is the best way to do that. In theory, it's like dating a barn, which is very difficult because the styles don't change, and most people don't spend a lot of time and money building their accessory buildings with current styles. I mean, if you're wealthy and you have a fabulous, Greek Revival house, you might have Greek Revival elements on your carriage house. For the most part, it's very difficult to date them. The hope is that there's some newspaper, records that will mention on, property has a house, a barn, and a carriage house on it. But architecturally, it's tough. People used logs in barns and outbuildings much later than they did in houses because, for the most part, animals were not snobby about that and really didn't care as long as they were warm. And it was cheaper to do something on site with existing trees than it is take them to a sawmill and do so. So it's very difficult, unfortunately, to date those buildings. And the smaller they are, the more difficult they are to date. And the simpler they are, the more difficult they are to date because even newspaper accounts presume you own that. And sometimes it will tell you there's a house and barn and an outbuilding. So it's very difficult, unfortunately.
The other question is, does the presence of a separate summer kitchen indicate a time period?
The presence of a separate summer kitchen more often, to me, represents that the people were German rather than English and use that style. It goes back to the reason I was trying to find the beehive oven that I showed in the slide. I'm trying to figure out when that ended. One would think that as iron cooking stoves become more common in the mid to later 19th century, you do better in keeping the heat limited in the summertime, and there would not be the need for that. They are often still used as outside structures for rendering lard and other purposes. And we just generally call them summer kitchens because they have a big fireplace and sometimes cauldrons. But again, without any, data on the fact, I would think they are probably by the mid-19th century not being built anymore. We have one more question in here if we can do.
Struck the frame portion of the stone house. I mean, like,
The question was about dendrochronology, and I will explain its limitations. You have to have a big enough piece of wood where you can penetrate it all the way to find out when it started growing, count all the rings, and then you do a statistical analysis of the spacing between them and put that against the known weather factors and known dating examples. So you can't do it on a plank. You can't do it on a small piece of wood. You have to do it on a substantial log. So typically in a house will be the log floor joists or the chimney mantle, but not anyplace else. And that's part of the game you play. Also, they could have been reused from an older structure and brought in.
Now, you can see these beams.
Yes, you can, because there's extra mortise holes. That's one way. And Bob and I went to a number of barns together, and we could see the floor joists of the barn, the corners were notched, which says that came from a log crib. And they took down the log crib barn, and they built the Pennsylvania Bank barn. Instead of throwing away a perfectly good piece of 20-foot lumber, they reuse it. People reuse materials all the time. It was cheaper than going out and getting new materials. And if you're a frugal Pennsylvania farmer, you're not going to spend money where you don't have to. There's a question way in the back that I missed. No? Any other questions online?
Looks like one last one. Does a beehive oven help date a house?
It should, but I have not been able to figure out how to define it in terms of when they stop being used. So again, it to me earlier rather than later. And when you see things like Peter Wentz house and a lot of documented 18th century houses, they have beehive ovens. If you see houses after 1850s or 60s, they rarely have beehive ovens. So that very broad swath, then yes, they do help.
Great, thanks.
Oh, well, one more in the corner.
A lot of times you'll see a house, it looks old, and you're not sure, and the window frame is not out at the base of the stone.
Well, the point was that you look at old houses and you look at physical features that may suggest that it's old or not. One of the things about window frames in stone houses is by the 19th century, and I'll make up a percentage, I love making a percentage, 80% of stone houses are designed to be stuccoed. So when you pull the stucco off, the window frames and door frames will be standing proud away from the stone, perhaps as much as 2 or 3 inches. So the issue is not that it's new, it's the issue that they've changed the exterior, they've taken off the original stucco, because when it was built, it was designed to be flush with the outside of the stucco. So I understand, I do the same thing, I drive around and look at old houses, but there's often more than one explanation for something that just doesn't look right.
The windows are put in the framing, and the stone is proud of the window.
Right.
And the older frame was actually out at the base of the stone, helped support the stone above, and then there was a wooden lintel on the inside.
The comment was that when people who, what we call lick and stick stone or put stone on the outside, they don't take the time to bring the framing out to make it look like it was actually the way it was built. I'm dealing with a person who's going to restore an old barn. They're going to put SIPS panels in for 4-inch foam, and because they want to see the insides of it. So again, you have to then take out all your windows, put them flush with the outside, because otherwise it doesn't look right. All right. Well, I've kept you all more than the hour that was promised, but I will stick around, and I don't know how to end this show.
I can take care of it.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.